As a retired history professor and as a veteran, Army veteran, I'm really delighted to talk about this subject, this anniversary of D-Day 75 years ago yesterday. My students complained they suffered through an hour-long lecture on the subject, so I just want to say brace yourselves. No, I'll try to make this a little reasonably short, but it is so interesting, and it is such an exciting story. My father was at Okinawa, the invasion of Okinawa, and my favorite uncle was at the invasion of Normandy, both really very bloody operations. But you know, they didn't talk about it very much. I never really heard any specifics, and I only had the vaguest details growing up of what happened in those invasions. But that's not unusual. As I've talked to other senators here in the last few days, a lot of World War II, a lot about World War II remains unspoken, only to be learned about after the deaths of our fathers and grandfathers and relatives. I think they just wanted to put that experience, that really horrendous experience, behind them. We know them as the greatest generation. I think we could easily call them the quietest generation. They didn't brag about their experiences. Less than 3% of the 16 million American veterans of World War II are still alive today, less than 3%, and those that are in their 90s and beyond. So, Madam President, on June 6, 1944, 75 years ago yesterday, General Dwight Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, gave the go-ahead for what was and what became the largest amphibious military operation in the history of the world. It was called Operation Overlord. It was codenamed D-Day. This was the Allied invasion of northern France. When the day broke, when the day began yesterday, 75 years ago, there were already 18,000 Americans and British who had parachuted on the ground in France already, 18,000. By 6:30 a.m., American troops began coming ashore at Utah and at Omaha beaches. The British and the Canadians came ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. And for the most part, these beach landings had fairly light opposition, and they captured the beaches readily. But that was not the case for the Americans at Omaha Beach. The United States 1st Division, called the Big Red One, battled high seas, weather, mines, and heavy fire from the German coastal batteries, including an elite infantry division. Many wounded Americans died and drowned in the high tide. As our soldiers moved off the beaches, they were met with heavy fire from the German army. By the end of this day, 75 years ago, 155,000 Allied troops had successfully stormed Normandy's beaches. In 3 months' time, fairly short, the northern part of France was free, and we were ready then to enter Germany and meet up with the Soviet forces who were coming from the east. D-Day was the largest air and sea invasion, as I said, in history. 73,000 soldiers from the United States, 83,000 soldiers from Britain and Canada. Some historians have called it the most important day in the 20th century. We had been planning this attack for over a year. More than 11,000 airplanes, 5,000 ships were involved. And through all of this, it remained a secret, a surprise to Nazi Germany. As a former Army intelligence officer, I've always been fascinated by the deceptions that took place. These deceptions were called Operation Bodyguard, and the purpose was to mislead the German army as to what the date was and what the location was of this Allied landing. A fictitious U.S. Army group under Lieutenant General George Patton convinced the Germans that the main attack was going to take place at Calais, to the east and to the north. The main attack was to be there. It was, of course, a ruse. Radio messages were sent out giving that impression that most of the Allied troops are actually stationed at Calais, along with, if you've seen the films, plywood airplanes and balloon tanks. General Patton, of course, was one of our most aggressive and successful generals who went on during the invasion to be in France and in Germany. And with him stationed in England until July 6th, the Germans were convinced that we would not waste our most famous general, and that they were convinced that a major attack would take place at Calais. Other deceptive actions are really interesting, dropping dummy paratroopers over Le Havre, so the Germans believed there was an airborne landing there. A metal foil was dropped at Calais, convincing the German radar operators that there was a convoy there in the water, along with small boats that were sent out with barrage balloons. The German army was confused by these tricks, and also by the absence of their most famous general, their most famous field marshal, Erwin Rommel, who had gone home to be with his wife for her birthday, thinking there would never be an attack when the weather conditions were so bad. But Eisenhower had learned the weather would improve enough for a June 6th invasion. But if he waited, the next weather opening would be 2 weeks later. And at which time, 2 weeks later, actually, a major storm did hit the beaches of Normandy, and that would have made it impossible for our landings to have occurred. And we also must recognize, I believe, at this time, the importance of the French resistance. They had a campaign of sabotage of the rail system, of electric facilities, delaying enemy forces moving towards Normandy, cutting underground telephone and teleprinter cables. Due to this French resistance, actually they had destroyed, by the time of the Normandy invasion, they had destroyed 52 locomotives and cut the railway lines in more than 500 places. Pretty remarkable. So, Madam President, here we are 75 years later. Yesterday it began very early in the morning in France, with hundreds gathering at the shore, at the water's edge, to remember the troops who had stormed the Normandy beaches and turned the tide of war. President Trump was there, President Macron of France. They praised the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen, as well as those survivors. The speeches were quite powerful about this surprising air and sea operation, bringing tens of thousands of men to Normandy. President Trump said, and if I can read, Madam President.
Permission granted.
President Trump said, "You are the pride of our nation. You are the glory of our republic, and we thank you from the bottom of our heart." President Macron praised the courage, the generosity, the strength of spirit, he said, to help men and women that didn't know, men and women they didn't know, to liberate land most had never seen for no other cause than freedom and democracy. Macron spoke of France's debt to the United States for freeing France from Nazi Germany. He said, "We know what we owe to you, veterans, our freedom." Yesterday there was a 21-gun salute early in the morning into the waters below the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, across the rows of white crosses and stars of David, the final resting place of more than 9,380 who died. Prime Minister May of Great Britain also said, "If one day can be said to have determined the fate of generations to come in France, in Britain, in Europe, and in the world, that day was the 6th of June, 1944. She went on to say that not one of the thousands of men arriving in Normandy 75 years ago knew whether they would still be alive when the sun set. The D-Day invasion was a defining moment in our history, with unpredictable weather, chaos, bravery, which carved out a beachhead on ground that Nazi Germany had occupied for over 4 years, occupied and reinforced for 4 years. In his order of the day, launching the invasion, General Eisenhower wrote, "The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory." That single day, D-Day, cost the lives of 4,414 Allied troops. 2,501 of them were Americans. More than 5,000 were injured. From Normandy, Allied troops advanced the war, taking Paris that summer, racing on against the Soviet army to control as much of German territory as could be possible before Hitler died and Germany surrendered in May of 1945. The Normandy invasion is an enormously important day, enormously important for us to remember, Madam President. We owe the participants, those who died on the beaches, those who survived, an enormous debt of gratitude. And we must remember their sacrifices. We can't forget history, or we are doomed to repeat it.